The Benefactors by Bruce Miller. In college, I took a philosophy class from a professor who suffered from cerebral palsy and dressed like Oscar Wilde. He'd tap the podium with his cigarette holder to start class, then invite discussion of Hegel's Owl of Minerva and Nietzsche's Amore Fati. Marooned in the country of the young, these were among the things that were lost on me. Are suffering, loss, and everything in between as good or necessary as anything else? Do you only understand your history after it's too late? If everything recurred infinitely over an infinite period of time, would you be willing to relive your life? Once you understand the developmental logic of your history, can you become reconciled to it and not want things to have gone differently? Years earlier, riding home with Mimi after school, I told her I'd be just as happy to quit now and take a job at Oldsmobile. She slammed on the brakes, swerved to the curb, looked me in the eye, and said, "Look, you are not going to do that. You're going to graduate and go to college." So, there I was at Michigan State, trying to fathom the significance our caped professor attached to a metaphorical owl that flew only at dusk. Lost on me, but I liked his style. One day he stopped mid-sentence, said he had to meet someone at 3, rushed to the window, and clambered down a fire escape connected to the building by bolts that wiggled like loose teeth. A kid in the class said he looked like Batman on a mission. Gobsmacked, I nodded. Later it occurred to me he might be demonstrating what Rilke called living the questions. My Uncle Charlie wanted to go to college. He started, but family responsibilities and a world war always kept the dream out of reach. Out of high school he drove a jalopy to campus and back and told me the family was reported to the welfare office by a neighbor who thought no one receiving public assistance should have a car. Well into his 80s, he would walk the campus and audit classes. My Uncle George worked at the college. His wife was pregnant with their first child when he summoned up his nerve to ask John Hanna for a raise. Hanna boosted his pay by $10 an hour, but he had to promise not to tell anyone. He worked 3 jobs to support a large family and took them to the sunny shores of Higgins Lake every summer for vacations. My Uncle Joe never expressed interest in college. He devoured Zane Grey novels, worked nights as a timekeeper at Oldsmobile, played the ponies in Detroit, and was a regular at Fuzzy's Tavern, where poker was always on tap. Mimi was a good student, a member of the National Honor Society. She was in 6th grade at Main Street School when Mussolini started a war with Ethiopia. The teacher asked the class if anyone could name Ethiopia's leader. Mimi's hand shot up, and she answered, Haile Selassie. She wanted to go to college and attended night classes but stopped after 2 terms saying the work was easy but she was too busy with her job at the Capitol and long nights didn't help. I think she was too busy because in addition to working and taking college classes, she was raising me and helping her mother. My grandmother, Martha, suffered a stroke in 1957. After her stroke, Mimi gave me a choice: Grandma could live at our house, or we could move in with her. That was easy. Grandma's house was a gathering place. Everyone visited Grandma so I'd see my cousins more often. We could run around like chickens with our heads cut off, fight over who got to sit on the heat register on cold days and play hide and seek. One hiding place was the front closet, where a sturdy Kirby vacuum stood watch over a mink stole and a fur coat. I knew some of what it took for a Syrian peasant to end up in a big house with a Kirby and furs. My mother gave me the general outline of Grandma's story when I was 6. She left the old country for Michigan in 1907, had an arranged marriage, 6 children, became a widow in 1934 when my mother was 10, muddled through the Depression only to encounter even worse problems at the start of World War II. She was afraid she would lose her house. Mimi finished high school and started her first job at a bank. Her employer, Joseph Gleason, intervened. Kismet. For decades the story whispered, "Write me." Marooned by plague, I did. It pulled from memory was supplemented by news articles, New Deal history, and conversations with the 90-year-old son of Gleason's only heir. Everyone in it is real, and everything in the story happened. There are 3 invented scenes, each begins with the word imagine. I think the story is interesting, but these things always are to the people involved. Chapter 1, Prosperous Beginnings. In 1896 R.E. Olds was a mechanic tinkering in his father's garage on River Street when he assembled the first practical horseless carriage. Olds knew he had something worth pursuing and declared he would produce them at scale if investors came forward. Olds Motor Works was born, and in short order, the company was selling more automobiles than any other brand. In 1904, Olds left the company after an argument with investors. They were eager to make a bigger, more costly version, and he wanted to sell more of the smaller cars to working men. A year later, with new investors, he formed the R.E. Olds Company and, before long, a second car with his name on it, or more precisely, His initials topped sales charts. Not content with the miracle of forming two successful car companies, Olds started Capital National Bank in 1906. A growing population needed homes, business and factory owners needed capital, and the bank provided it using the house or building or a company's stock as collateral. He ordered up 15,000 savings passbooks, put a penny in each, had them handed out in schools as a lesson in thrift, and encouraged children to add their nickels and dimes. Joseph W. Gleason was born a year after Olds in 1865, worked at the post office in 1882, lit out for the territory soon after, and learned the paint trade in Colorado. Bedazzled by the sight of silver being extracted from lead, he returned to Lansing and named the firm he started Silver Lead Paint. He married Mary Ryan, a traveling auditor for the Singer Sewing Machine Company, and the couple made Silver Lead the premier paint firm in the region. Joseph and Mary lived a block north of St. Mary's, and childless, were always on the lookout for a boy or girl to help with their house and yard. If you worked for them, they didn't pay you. Instead, they gave or did something for you in return. Vincent O'Leary was 12 when he started working for the Gleasons. What they did for him was raise him as their own and give him a job at Silver Lead. Mary learned about Vincent from a nun at school who said he was often beaten and locked in the basement of the house where he lived with his uncle and aunt. Gleason visited the uncle and told him that he and Mary thought it would be a good idea if the boy moved in with them. He'd be closer to school and less likely to get in trouble. Gleason was an imposing figure. Vincent's uncle did not argue. The Gleasons attended church at St. Mary's, where Father O'Rafferty encouraged parishioners to donate to his St. Anthony Society. O'Rafferty was proud to say it helped people regardless of race or creed and told parishioners that he investigated each case personally to assure recipients were worthy. Interestingly, he also said he gave loafers money if he figured it would prevent a stick-up. Frank and Martha Howdad also attended St. Mary's. They grew up 21 miles apart in the old country and met in Lansing the day of their wedding, arranged by Martha's brother in 1910. Martha was 18 when she arrived in 1907, sent by her father to work as a housekeeper for two brothers already working at Oldsmobile. Under marks of identification on her immigration record, the inspector noted and drew a picture of a small tattoo on her right hand. It was a dot surrounded by lines that resembled a peaked roof with crosses running up one side and down the other. The peaked roof symbolized the protection of home, the crosses represented the church and the dot signified Martha. Frank was a hard worker who did not abide by poor conditions at Seeger Engine Works, walked out with other men in 1912, was arrested for picketing, and spent a few nights in jail. In 1913, helping build the new St. Mary's Cathedral, Frank found the end of a 2x12-inch joist in a debris pile. It was the perfect size for a cutting board, so he smoothed its edges and gave it to Martha. In 1915 he worked for the Lansing Fuel Company and put a down payment on a house on Olds Avenue. Vincent O'Leary finished school in 1917 and was drafted into the Army, serving with the 16th Engineers in France. He rode often to the woman he called Aunt Mary. That was the year of the national coal shortage. In December, with the crisis at its worst, Gleason visited the city official responsible for the emergency distribution of coal. He said he didn't have much himself, but he had a team, some barrels, and could spare some for people with none. He told the man he didn't want anyone in Lansing to suffer if he could prevent it. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 impacted Lansing less than other places. The Journal reported cases in Michigan were 2/3 less than those in the eastern United States. None of Frank and Martha's family was impacted by the flu, though there was a child who died from a rat bite in those years. Back from the war, Vincent tried repaying Gleason money borrowed before he left. Gleason refused to take it, but Vincent insisted, saying it weighed on his conscience since he was about to do something Joseph would not like. Gleason asked him what that might be, and Vincent told him he planned to buy a motorcar. Gleason believed no working men needed one. He laughed and said that if Vincent could afford a motorcar, he guessed he could afford to pay the money he owed him. Frank worked at REO but never owned a motorcar and walked or took the trolley everywhere he went. After a year at REO, he moved on to Capital Casting. By 1920 he saved enough to take Martha and sons Joe, George, and Charlie to the old country for a visit. Bandits chased their stagecoach on the way to Frank's village, and Turks murdered a relative of his while they were off visiting Martha's family. She was eager to return home to electricity and running water. On the trip back to Lansing, she crossed paths with a gypsy who gave her the evil eye, and Martha was sure the encounter resulted in the death of her newborn son shortly after they arrived home. The First World War came to be called the War to End All Wars, but it didn't. One reason it didn't was because in 1923, a survivor of World War I, Adolf Hitler, led an insurrection against the Bavarian government. He and his mob of Nazi followers were thwarted by police, and he was arrested and tried for treason. His sentence was 5 years, but he was released 9 months later. That all seemed far away to people in the United States. In Lansing, silver-lead paint prospered, and in 1923 Joseph and Mary Gleason donated 4 acres of land for the new St. Lawrence Hospital. In 1924 Frank Haddad took his oldest son Joe to the parade put on by the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan was becoming more active and visible, and parades like this one were intended to reflect positively on the group, to show them performing good works. Klansmen saw themselves as upholding traditional American values as opposed to Catholics, blacks, immigrants and Jews who, they believed, were changing traditional American culture. Father O'Rafferty and other like-minded clergymen did not abide by such nonsense. When Klansmen passed St. Mary's during the parade, O'Rafferty called out and shamed men he recognized under hoods and capes. Olds prospered throughout this period and found new outlets for his ambitions. In 1929 Olds rode up in the bucket of the steam shovel that broke ground for the 22-story Olds Tower. He reserved the tower lobby for Capital National, commissioned brass elevator doors depicting scenes from his life, and had his private office and conference room at the top. Imagine riding the elevator up with Olds. He might use the lever to manipulate the lift like a carnival ride, amplify the hemodynamic effects of gravity on passengers and add to the dizziness people already experienced when he was around. Out the conference room windows, he could point to the factory he gave up in the fight with investors in 1904 and the REO plant south of the railroad tracks he started a year later. To the east was Sparrow Hospital, built with his philanthropy, and the Olds Engineering Building at the State College. In every direction were businesses, parks, churches, schools, and working men's houses built in the boom years. Men like Gleason and Olds owned businesses and hired others to run them. Paint was easy to make: mix oil and lead, put it in a can. Cars needed more ingredients, and Olds invented the supply chain to provide them. He hired Oldsmen to keep it all running, men loyal and active in civic affairs. One was Earl Goodnow, president of Olds Atlas Drop Forge. Outside work Goodnow raised money for the Palmer Shoe Fund for destitute school children. Gleason had Harry Hughes in charge of Silverlead's back office and Vincent O'Leary, who managed the front. Joseph played cards at the Elks Club, dabbled in real estate, and stopped at the paint store most afternoons where if he saw something he didn't like, he'd collar the man responsible and say, "What did you do that for?" Olds' many interests included Florida real estate and yachting. He was often gone from Lansing but was a quick study and would change tack when he saw something was amiss with one of his enterprises. Imagine a hot summer evening in 1931. Cars going over the Logan Street Bridge make a shoosing noise that sounds like they are driving in the rain. Frank Haddad is on his porch sipping a juice glass of homemade wine. The 3 boys are out tonight with friends, Martha, and the 3 little girls are inside, Mimi, Madeline, and newborn Emmeline lulled to sleep by the sound of industrial hammers pounding in drop forges at either end of town. You would think the sound would keep them awake, but the pounding is steady, like a heartbeat. Lightning bugs rise and fall in the yard, and Frank can see lights are also burning atop Olds Tower. He hoists the glass in that direction. The great man might be up there tonight planning his next grand venture. Kismet. Chapter 2. Things fall apart. The day after Christmas in 1931, a rumor spread that Lansing City National Bank was low on cash. People panicked and came to get theirs out. Capital National was unaffected, but Olds, concerned the panic would spread, joined other leaders to keep City National from collapsing. The idea was for City National to merge with his larger bank. Capital National depositors would be at risk, so leaders organized 2 guarantors groups who pledged $1.5 million to protect depositors at Olds Bank. Olds accomplished the merger and averted the crisis. It did not stop the Depression. By 1932 unemployment was 25%. 1,800 Lansing families were getting sacks of flour each month from the welfare department. Then as now, if you'd borrowed money and did not make payments, the bank could take your property, sell it, pay itself and give you what was left. On January 26, a former Lansing man named D.J. Meade drove up from Detroit to settle a score with Frank Gorman, Capital National's president. Behind on payments, the bank sold Meade's property, paid itself, and gave him what was left. Meade had lunch and a shave at the Roosevelt Hotel, then went to Capital National's lobby and asked for Gorman. Assistant cashier B.W. Nichols said Gorman wasn't in. Meade didn't wait for his return. He took out a pistol and shot Nichols dead. Then he walked up the west side of the bank and kept firing. The next shot was A.A. Alciser, bank vice president. Marshall Westfall, assistant cashier, jumped to Elsesser's aid while Meade kept blazing away. Bank guard David Timmons and customer John Lilly were the next to fall. Then bank patron Lucille Duncan was hit, the compact in her purse deflecting the bullet. Meade then put the pistol's barrel in his mouth and killed himself. That spring Earl Goodnow reported that the Palmer Shoe Fund for Destitute Children was $800 short every month. At the time, you could buy a pair of shoes for 98 cents at Penny's. When summer came, Olds pitched what he called a back-to-the-farm proposal calling on the state to give every unemployed person 10 acres and pre-cut lumber for a house they could build themselves. The plan went nowhere. The 1932 presidential election was on people's minds, and momentum was building to replace Hoover with Roosevelt. Gleason was already considered an old-timer in Lansing when he was pressed by friends to run for city alderman in the fall of 1932. Gleason also campaigned for FDR as president and Claude Cady for Congress. Earl R. Pitt, a longtime Lansing journalist, and friend of Gleason, wrote in his column that Joseph even bought a vote. Pitt wrote that seeing a stalled car in the road Gleason pushed it with his REO to a repair shop. The owner tried paying him for the push, but Joseph refused the money. Asking the man's address, he discovered it was in Cady's district and said, "If you raise your right hand and swear to cast as many votes as possible for Cady, I'll consider myself paid." Gleason, Cady and FDR all won their races. But before FDR took office in 1933, a bank panic started in Detroit and spread statewide. President Hoover sent the Commerce Secretary to ask Henry Ford to loan two Detroit banks money. Ford, the largest depositor in both banks, said no. He'd helped before but this time said the banks needed to find someone else. If they didn't, he said he'd pull his money out. Michigan's Governor William Comstock knew Ford making a run on his own banks would be a catastrophe and ordered a bank holiday on Valentine's Day, 1933, to prevent it. Olds, vacationing in Mexico, returned immediately, urged calm, and a return to the use of checks. The panic spread nationwide. Roosevelt took office just as banks were experiencing the worst financial catastrophe in history. Roosevelt temporarily closed banks and urged Congress to pass his Emergency Banking Act so solvent banks could reopen with newly created federal deposit insurance. FDR's Comptroller of Currency told examiners to value bank assets at their intrinsic worth, not depressed market prices so that more banks could pass solvency tests. The Comptroller told reopened banks to simply ignore missed loan payments until further notice. By May 1933, most banks were open, but for reasons that were never fully explained, Capital National fell short of solvency despite relaxed standards. Olds and the bank directors to petition for a conservator and announced plans for a new bank they would call Lansing National. Nathan Howell, former Michigan Milk Producers Association president, was appointed conservator. He set up an office at the tower and hired former Capital National employees to help with the work. One was Capital National's chief auditor, Marshall Westfall, the same man who kept Elsesser from bleeding to death during Meade's rampage. Watching these developments was Harry E. Moore, president of the Lansing Company. Moore had pledged securities in the 1931 merger. He suspected Capital National was insolvent itself as early as 1929, filed a lawsuit claiming fraud, and demanded the return of his securities. Other guarantors then joined the suit. Federal reviewers told Olds they would not issue the new bank's charter unless he canceled a $1 million lease with Capital National for space in the tower. Olds did, and in March 1934, the Comptroller approved the charter for the new bank and a federally backed loan from the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. The loan was equal to 40% of depositor money frozen at Capital National since Valentine's Day 1933. The Comptroller did not allow Lansing National to take Capital National under its wing. Instead, he ordered Capital National into receivership and appointed Joseph Gleason receiver. The RFC loan was welcomed, the appointment of Gleason as the receiver was not. Pitt had once written that Gleason went everywhere with a little fox terrier named Sailor. Pitt called the dog the Democrat who wears no man's collar. That label was now affixed to Gleason by the men losing control of the old bank. Asked about his new job, Gleason said he had a lot to learn. Hull had started the distribution of the loan, and Gleason would finish the process. Terms called for each depositor to get 40% of the money frozen in their account. Atlas, with $2.5 million frozen, received a $1 million payment. There were 37,000 other accounts. 15,000 were the so-called penny accounts of school children. Hull had received permission to exclude these from the distribution due to the cost of processing so many small checks. The loan money would assure that everyone else received 40% of what was listed in their account. Money to repay the taxpayer-backed loan would come from collections on loans made to individuals and businesses, and from the sale of property in default before the order to ignore slow loans was issued. The comptroller had asked all bankers and receivers for a report on the status of every single loan. The report would be created by listing loans under headings labeled safe, slow, doubtful, or loss. A slow loan was one where a borrower regularly missed payments. Loans in the loss column meant a borrower exceeded the limit of missed payments and was in default. The reports from bankers and receivers in all 48 states would provide a rough idea of how many homeowners would be at risk of default, foreclosure and homelessness if the order to ignore slow loans was lifted. The bank was also holding $1.5 million in securities pledged by Moore, Olds, and other guarantors in the 1931 merger between Capital National and City National. Gleason could not sell the securities because of Moore's lawsuit. If settled in favor of the receivership, Gleason could sell the collateral and return money to depositors. In preparation for the trial seeking the return of the securities pledged in the merger, Moore's lawyers asked Gleason for access to records from the old bank. Gleason refused their request. This was justifiable since the receiver's job was to protect the $1.5 million for depositors, not help Moore prove fraud. Moore's lawyers next asked a judge to force Gleason to comply with their subpoena, arguing that without records, proving fraud would be impossible. As the winter of 1934 turned to spring, Earl Goodnow, president of Atlas Drop Forge, appealed to Lansing businesspeople and citizens for donations to start a citywide recreation program. He warned of problems ahead for thousands of Lansing children idled by New Deal labor laws. New laws reduced the number of hours they could legally work from 60 to 40 per week. Meanwhile, Joe and George Haddad were out of school, working when and where they could. Charlie, in 11th grade, was doing the same. Mimi, Madeline, and Emmeline were 10, 8, and 3. Frank Haddad was unwell. Tuberculosis, an occupational hazard at Capital Casting, took his life in June at age 44. He left his widow Martha a small life insurance policy and a paid-up house. That summer, strong winds in the drought-stricken southern plains of the United States created dust storms from Texas to Nebraska. The storms ruined crops, uprooted people, and brought about government intervention in the form of introduction of erosion-preventing farming methods. Winds of war were also blowing across Europe. In July, Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss was assassinated by Nazis. A month later, Hitler united the chancellorship and presidency under the new title of Führer. In November, Lee Richardson, an RFC official, met with Gleason and Marshall Westphal to talk about the status of the loan. After work, the three went pheasant hunting at Gleason's farm. Pitt wrote that Joseph, being in a state of financial decrepitude, no doubt owing to the New Deal, failed to buy a license. Instead of hunting, he ran through the brush, scaring up birds for the others to shoot. He chided Gleason for taking the risk, saying, "Some of the boys with notes the receiver is trying to collect might have willfully and enthusiastically taken a shot at the old dog." That same month, Martha Haddad acquired a small grocery store on South Cedar Street using money from Frank's life insurance for the purchase. The idea was for Joe, George, and Charlie to operate the store to support the family, with George having primary responsibility as the proprietor. Meanwhile, workers in Washington completed tabulation of reports on the status of loans at every open and closed bank. Congress learned a third of all loans were slow. The percentage was sobering and confirmed fears that lifting the policy of ignoring missed payments too soon would result in more foreclosures and homelessness for people with no work or whose employment was sporadic. The comptroller sent letters to receivers and bankers, giving them the option to continue to ignore slow loans until conditions improved. The letter made clear that while they had a choice to do otherwise, continuing the policy would be in accord with the intent of the Emergency Banking Act. Bankers and receivers have complete discretion. They could also extend the term of loans, adjust interest rates, or reduce the principal balances to reflect lower property values. Borrowers could still find themselves in danger of foreclosure if a receiver concluded they could pay and were shirking their responsibility. Around this same time, a group of Capital National's largest depositors asked to meet with Gleason. They told him they wanted to receive regular updates on the receivership and the status of collections. Gleason explained he was a federally appointed official, not an employee of the bank, and denied their request. They took their disappointment to the paper, complaining that Gleason would not give them information about assets, liabilities, or what he was doing with loans the bank made when it was solvent. Soon after this, the Journal reported that the group formed a committee for the purpose of protecting the interest of depositors large and small. Earl Goodnow, president of Atlas Drop Forge, was secretary of the committee, and other members included former conservator Hull and the current and past publisher of the State Journal. In August, Gleason engaged in his last act as a city alderman. During a meeting he got into an argument with Lansing's police chief who wanted to change from angle to parallel parking on Washington Avenue. Gleason told the chief this would turn the avenue into a raceway. The chief countered with the claim that all Gleason wanted was to hold on to a few extra parking spots in front of silver lead paint and protect the interests of Vincent O'Leary. Vincent, in the audience, was livid, as was Gleason, and the ensuing exchange between the three men forced a recess to allow them to cool off. The journalist writing about the dust-up noted that one city official asked another, "Is Vincent O'Leary working overtime tonight?" In fact, Vincent was working overtime. He and his wife Genevieve were expecting triplets and were looking for a bigger house for their growing family. In October 1934, Moore's lawsuit was taken up in Judge Kelly Searle's courtroom at the courthouse in St. John's. As testimony droned on, Judge Searle, aware of other important events taking place, interrupted the proceedings to announce that the Detroit Tigers beat the St. Louis Cardinals in the second game of the World Series. On October 23, Vincent O'Leary and his wife Genevieve brought triplets home to a house not far from the Gleasons. In December 1934, Judge Searle ruled against Moore and the guarantors, voiding the subpoena his lawyers gave Gleason for records. Lawyers announced they would appeal the ruling to the Michigan Supreme Court. The Depositors Committee made an announcement too. It planned to petition the Comptroller of Currency to end the receivership. They said Gleason was taking too long to liquidate assets, and that legal fees were eating up money that could be returned to depositors. They pointed out that other banks in receivership were using local trustee groups to manage liquidation, and they wanted to follow that model. In May of 1935 the group met with the Comptroller's staff in Washington and made their pitch. After the meeting, the Comptroller's team told the committee they would discuss their plan with the Comptroller and get back to them. Summer came and went without a decision from the Comptroller about the Depositor Committee's plan, and the committee's frustration found its way into the Journal. Gleason was targeted by the Depositors Committee and its members complained that he could follow his own ideas, make any expenditures, in fact, do as he likes at any or all times without agreement on the part of depositors. An editorial in the Journal called the committee's plan vital to local industry and workers' futures. It mentioned but did not name a firm that had $2.5 million of its reserves frozen when the bank closed in 1933. It did not disclose that the taxpayer-backed loan had already returned 40% of that amount, $1 million, to Atlas Drop Forge. Another article claimed Detroit banks in receivership were getting loans without federal strings. The article did not reveal that the loans were from private investors and solvent banks, not the federal government. Also printed was the committee's suspicion that Gleason was working behind the scenes to scuttle their plan. Pensioners were dragged into the fray with the paper writing that under the localized liquidation plan, relief might come to those discouraged helpless depositors. It said instead of relief, governmental red tape hoists its feet upon its mahogany desk and twiddles its thumbs and is deaf in both ears. How pensioners were to receive money under the committee plan was an elaborate shell game. The committee wanted the federal government to loan money to the local trustee group. The group would use the loan to pay a handful of large corporate depositors all of the funds remaining in their frozen accounts. Then the corporate depositors would loan some of what they received back to the local trustee group so it could pay off the pensioners. In return for this so-called generosity, the local group would receive interest on the money lent until the local trustee group liquidated the bank's assets. Unmentioned was that ending the receivership would also end Gleason's tenure and create uncertainty about the policy of ignoring slow loans. The local trustee group would decide whose loans to ignore and whose to deem a loss subject to foreclosure. On the heels of this article, Olds and all former Capital National directors received registered letters from Gleason. The letters ordered them to appear in his office at 10 a.m. Saturday, October 26, where he would present them with a demand to repay illegal dividends and loans they approved when the bank was solvent. Announcing the summons, the Journal noted that more than one person who received it thought Gleason was exacting retribution for criticism of how he was managing the receivership. The publisher invited Gleason to take as much space as he needed, free of charge, and share his thoughts about the committee plan. Gleason said only that depositors would soon learn about the status of the receivership. It seemed as though dictators were everywhere. Mussolini had recently started a war with Ethiopia. At Main Street School a teacher asked if anyone could name Ethiopia's leader. Mimi Haddad raised her hand. She was called on and answered, Haile Selassie. Chapter 3. The Democrat who wears no man's collar. Imagine a fall evening. A tall man leaves his home on Walnut Street with a little fox terrier at his side. He pauses at St. Mary's Cathedral for a visit, walks a few blocks, and enters the lobby of Olds Tower. Greeting a young elevator operator, he asks about his family. They chat as the elevator moves swiftly to the top floor and a conference room where R.E. Olds is waiting along with the journalist Hurl Pitt. Pitt, a friend of Gleason and a confidant of Olds, is rumored to be the reporter the journal assigns when Olds wants his opinion in the paper. Pitt has arranged the meeting at the behest of Gleason. The three exchange pleasantries, admire the city out the conference room windows, then get down to business. Olds asks what Gleason can tell him about the summons he's issued. Gleason says he is not at liberty to talk about the matter. An auditor will address it at the meeting on October 26. The awkward moment passes, and Gleason says he asked for the meeting to talk about the Depositors Committee plan and to convey a proposal from the comptroller. He tells Olds the plan the committee presented and may caught comptroller staff off guard. They expected to see a proposal to have the receivership taken over by an outside investor or an eligible bank. Instead, the plan presented was one they could not recommend the comptroller approve. Olds asked Gleason why this was the case. Gleason told him there were 3 reasons. The first was that the committee wanted the federal government to loan money to the local trustee group without the conditions required by Congress. The comptroller could do this if a failed bank's assets were less than $30,000, but Capital National's were in the millions. The second had to do with the committee's plan for the loan. Gleason took a news article out of his pocket and handed it to Olds. It was the article explaining how pensioners would receive relief under the committee plan. He directed Olds' attention to a section that said the loan money would provide 100% relief to corporate depositors, who would then loan some of the money back to the committee to pay off pensioners. Gleason said the controller's staff told the committee in May that this was not allowable. Federal loan money had to be distributed equally to all depositors in proportion to the amounts in their frozen accounts. The third reason was the committee's plan to give corporate borrowers control over collateral they had put up for loans. They wanted to sell the deflated assets and buy different stocks in hopes they would go up in value. Gleason said the idea was novel but impermissible. If the new stocks went down instead of up and, God forbid, corporations defaulted on their loans, taxpayers and other depositors would be on the hook for losses, not the people who made the poor investments. He said the staff could have told the committee no immediately, but there were hearings underway on the Hill about loosening regulations. After consulting with the comptroller, the decision was to wait until after the hearings before making a judgment. The hearings produced no significant changes, and the office, busy with other work, neglected to get back with the committee. The oversight was regrettable, but it did not change anything. Gleason then explained that the comptroller was always looking for ways to have one less bank to oversee. Staff already had their hands full with 1,400 in receivership, and more were failing each month. Gleason told Olds that when the steady stream of news about the committee's dissatisfaction with the receivership reached Washington, he and the comptroller talked about a way for the receivership to end. That way was to involve an outside investor or an eligible bank. Lansing National Bank was ineligible due to the risks presented by Moore's lawsuit, but Gleason told Olds there was no reason Olds could not use his own money to take Capital National out of receivership. If he did this, he could delegate authority to manage the receivership to anyone he wanted. He could allow the corporations to engage in stock speculation with their collateral and control what managers did with loans the bank made when it was still solvent. Gleason said the comptroller could draw up an agreement to end federal oversight in short order. All Olds needed to do was agree to accept financial responsibility. Then Gleason shook hands with Olds and Pitt, bid them a good evening, and went home to marry. After Gleason left, Olds walked to the window and looked out over the city. He knew there was talk about using the old bank as leverage in the fight with union organizers. If union supporters with loans at the old bank were threatened with layoff or termination and knew the local trustee group could foreclose on them, they might be less enthusiastic about supporting the union. He understood that Fordmen were using this tactic in Detroit. Olds considered it morally objectionable, repugnant, something he would not allow in Lansing. It might be advantageous to sell deflated stocks held as collateral for company loans and buy other stocks in hopes of a continued rise in the market. But if their value went down, the new collateral could be worth less than the old. The summons from Gleason also brought uncertainty. The charge of making illegal loans and dividends was serious, but Olds believed it was without merit. Moore's case before the Supreme Court was a different matter. Olds would be better off if Moore lost, as it would free up to $1.5 million for depositors. Some of that was Olds' money, but only some. If the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Moore and the fraud case went to trial, it could expose Olds to significantly more liability, perhaps even criminal charges. He looked out over the city his ingenuity and ambition built when he was younger. He had just turned 71. Winter was coming. Leaving the receivership in the hands of Gleason and the federal government made sense. It put a tourniquet on his potential losses. Olds sat down and talked to Pitt about an article for the next day's paper. The meeting portrayed as fiction, but the contextual variables are not. Setting the imagined meeting to the side, something did happen. Just 24 hours after publishing its most astringent criticism of Gleason, the Journal reversed its position. An unsigned editorial on the front page of the Journal said that Joseph W. Gleason is in no way to be blamed for the government's policy. The real problems, it said, were government rules and poor timing. The editorial said that if bureaucrats had approved the local liquidation plan in May, owners of stock used as collateral for loans could have exchanged low-performing equities for stocks that went up this summer. These stocks could have been sold in October, with borrowers paying their debt to the bank with money left over. The reason that didn't happen, the article said, was that the government looks upon such shifts as speculative. The editorial presented a single element of the committee's plan in a favorable light, predicted its success with 20/20 hindsight, and made it abundantly clear that the time had passed to take advantage of the opportunity. It also said the former directors would meet with Gleason as ordered but would defend themselves against the charge of wrongdoing and even take the government to court if necessary. Only one person would speak like this on behalf of all former directors, R. E. Olds. Was the piece written to showcase Olds' opinion? No one is alive to say. Could Olds have brought about the abrupt change in the paper's position? Without a doubt, he could. In 1935 Lansing was still Olds' town. The October 26 meeting took place, and the Journal reported Olds and other directors believed an auditor simply misunderstood the records. To clear things up, a committee would prepare a letter to the comptroller. The paper never wrote another word about the comptroller's demand that Olds and other directors repay illegal loans and dividends. As for the committee plan, a short article appeared later, referencing a letter from the comptroller that said the delay in responding to the plan was the fault of the comptroller's office, not the committee. On January 6, 1936, the Michigan Supreme Court upheld the dismissal of Moore's claim saying Gleason, a federal official, had done nothing wrong in refusing to honor the subpoena. The court ruled the guarantor agreement was valid. Moore and others might lose money, or their collateral might be worth more than when they pledged it. The answer to that question would not be known until the securities were sold, something Gleason could do now that the case was decided. Gleason moved his office out of the tower and into the City National Building, and Pitt wrote a homing pigeon with a bend on its leg made a crash landing on the ledge outside Joseph's office window. The bird didn't leave, so Gleason put out food and water, leaving his window open for it to come inside and roost. Pitt wrote that the bird stayed until its condition improved, unlike raging debtors who do not visit the receiver's office unless officially summoned. That summer unemployment fell to 17%. Hitler's Aryan Supermen were humiliated by Jesse Owens and other black Americans in the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Hitler, Mussolini and Japan's Hirohito formed an alliance which sent a clear signal to the rest of the world about what lay ahead. In October, Roosevelt, running for a second term, was in Lansing as part of a whistle-stop tour. He gave a short speech from the back of the train at the South Washington rail station next to the REO factory. Mimi Haddad was in the crowd straining to hear Roosevelt talk about the importance of continuing policies that were aiding in the recovery. In November of 1936, in a bid to protect her young daughters from the goings-on at a social club on nearby Cowles Avenue, Martha Haddad made an offer on a house several blocks north of Haddad's grocery. The offer was contingent on a list of repairs and refurbishments itemized by Charlie Haddad in neatly typed single-space on 3 sheets of onion skin paper. Martha converted the family home on Olds Avenue into a rooming house to produce income, and the family moved to their new home on Cedar Street. Madeline and Mimi started attending a new school. Madeline sat across the aisle from a boy named Malcolm Little, whose father, a minister in Lansing, was run over by a streetcar in September 1931. The day after Christmas, a belated present arrived for Capital National depositors, an $800,000 settlement from Moore, other guarantors, and Capital National shareholders. The money allowed Gleason to issue a 100% payoff for depositors with accounts of $200 or less, including the 15,000 school children. Times were changing. In 1937, a sit-down strike closed REO for 6 weeks. In June, thousands of workers gathered at Michigan and Washington Avenues in a labor holiday. Gleason had a bird's-eye view from his 4th-floor office in the City National Building. Charlie Haddad won second place and $75 in the Fisher Body Craftsman Guild Napoleonic Coach Building Competition. Gleason's dog died in 1937, and Pitt eulogized him, writing that, "Sailor, who had never been on a ship, is being mourned by Gleason the way some of the bank's creditors mourn depression, stock market losses and deflated hopes of great riches. In November of 1937, against their mother's wishes, the Haddad boys decided to close the store and listed its inventory, and fixtures for sale. All three had better jobs. Charlie was also taking college classes. The store took up too much time and produced too little money. Progress made on increasing employment came to a halt when a recession hit in 1938 and unemployment rose to 19%. On the sports front, Joe Louis knocked out Max Schmeling for the heavyweight championship and Joe Haddad cheered. In Germany, Hitler continued persecution of Jews. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, seeking to prevent another world war, undertook a policy of appeasement, allowing Hitler to occupy Czechoslovakia. He returned from a meeting with Hitler declaring he'd achieved peace in our time. Orson Welles created a panic on Halloween when he broadcast a radio play of War of the Worlds as though it were a news story. In January of 1939 the horror story in Europe was getting worse and gaining momentum. Hitler warned that if Jewish financiers started a war with Germany, the result would be the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. In April of that year, contralto Marian Anderson was denied use of Constitution Hall for a concert by the Daughters of the American Revolution. Her race was the reason. Eleanor Roosevelt immediately resigned from the DAR and offered Anderson the use of the Lincoln Memorial for the concert. Madeline Haddad won a contest put on by the Gladmer Theatre that involved picking the top movies of the year. She came in second and received 6 months of free admissions to the theater. During these years, Mary Gleason began to suffer from dementia. The O'Learys and the Gleasons often visited each other after church. At the Gleasons, there were milkshakes for the children. At the O'Learys, Vincent and Joseph played ferocious games of two-handed pinochle punctuated by shouts of "take that" as they pounded cards onto the table. Chapter 4. The end of the receivership. After Germany invaded Poland, England declared war on Germany and the Second World War was at hand. Factories converted to war production. Jobs, scarce since 1930, were plentiful, though no one found joy or took comfort in the reason. Pitt wrote a dog named Nick was now making rounds with Gleason. Nick's owner, Tommy McFarlane, a neighbor on nearby Ionia Street, enlisted and needed someone to look after the dog. After Pearl Harbor, with dread and determination, more men and women left to fight the Axis. Lansing hummed around the clock as factories made trucks, guns, ammunition, airplane propellers, and other armaments. In January 1942, there was a fire at the Haddads' rooming house on Olds Avenue. Martha, months behind on payments for her home on Cedar Street and now without regular income from the rooming house, had a problem. Joe and George, with families and mortgages of their own, were in a poor position to help. Charlie expected to be drafted any day. Gleason sold the bank's last asset, the City National Building. Funds from its sale would constitute the final payment to depositors in the end of the receivership. The last tasks were carried out with the help of a new employee, Mildred Haddad. Mimi was 17, a January graduate of Eastern High School. Mimi was recommended for the job by her teachers, but Gleason also remembered her mother Martha from St. Mary's. When the work was finished, Joseph helped Mimi find another job. But he also learned about the boarding house fire and that Martha was behind on house payments. Martha Haddad's loan was with Prudential Life Insurance, not Capital National. Gleason contacted Prudential and negotiated a reduction in the principal balance in return for the promise of an immediate payoff. Then he arranged a private party loan to provide the funds to pay off Prudential. Martha now owed less money and had a lower monthly payment. She sold the boarding house in June and Charlie Haddad entered the Army Air Corps. Then Martha paid off the private loan and lived the rest of her life free of house payments. Once the liquidation of Capital National Bank was completed, Gleason locked the door of the receiver's office on the 4th floor of the City National Bank for the last time. Then he went home to take care of Mary. In August 1944, Gleason ordered coal for the winter. The worker shortage left it up to him to move all 14 tons to his basement. He was 79 years old. Pitt wrote, "Comrade Gleason emerged, covered with soot and dripping with sweat. Difference between Mr. Gleason's perspiration and that of the boys sweated by him as receiver was temperature. Joseph's was good and hot. That of the brothers who had faced him when he was receiver was generally cold and clammy." The same worker shortage that turned Gleason into a coal hauler caused factories to recruit women in 1944. Martha Haddad hired in at Oldsmobile, working until she reached retirement age, earning Social Security and a pension. A year later, in 1945, after living nearly 40 years in the United States, Martha Haddad became a naturalized citizen. In August 1945 the Journal reported with fanfare and excitement that Tommy McFarlane had been rescued from a Japanese prison camp and was coming home to reclaim his dog Nick from Gleason. Soon after this, the Journal reported there had been a mix-up. The rescued man had the same name, but Lansing's Tommy McFarlane had been lost in the sinking of the USS Houston in 1942 along with 742 other men. On his 85th birthday in 1949, Olds told the Journal he stopped making investments after FDR took office. He was quoted as saying there has been no incentive considering high taxes, labor difficulties, and the other problems. Reminded that Henry Ford had attended his 75th birthday celebration, Olds said, "Well, he won't be here this time." Ford had died in 1947. Olds, the last living auto pioneer, died in 1950. Gleason, the Democrat who wore no man's collar, died that same year, 3 years after his wife Mary. When Gleason had closed the receiver's office in 1942, men from Silver Lead carried his mahogany desk from the City National Building to the paint store. As of 2021 the desk was still in use at what is now called O'Leary Paint. Records of receivership showed that Gleason and his staff returned 91% of account holder money, well above the 58% average of all receivers in the era. Marshall Westphal, who saved the life of A. Alcesser during Meade's rampage, died in 1968 after a long career as president of Ionia County National Bank. During his time at Capital National, Westphal rose to the position of head of the audit department. After Capital National was ordered into receivership, Westphal worked with Gleason. He was almost certainly the auditor who discovered the alleged illegal distributions and loans that brought about the showdown between Gleason, Olds and the other members of the Capital National Bank directors. Vincent O'Leary's wife Genevieve died in 1974 and Vincent died in 1980. They left 6 children, 26 grandchildren, 9 great-grandchildren, and a company that his descendants still operate in Lansing. Earl R. Pitt, who wrote for a half-century at the Journal, died in 1956. Pitt was credited in his obituary as having coined the phrase North Lansing against the world. Every story Pitt wrote about Gleason included a quip about harried borrowers fearful of the hangman at the bank. But the record shows that few knew better than Earl Pitt that Gleason was well liked and known for his generosity. Another who knew was Father O'Rafferty, and as it came out at Gleason's funeral, the bishop and every priest in Lansing and in surrounding communities who approached Gleason to ask his help for a parishioner. Martha Haddad's children thrived in post-war America. On Sundays, she cooked traditional Syrian dishes for them, their spouses, and her grandchildren. When a grandchild asked about the tattoo on her hand, she claimed with a straight face that her brothers and sisters all had them so their mother could tell them apart. After she died in 1968, Charlie Haddad, with the same precision he used to make the Napoleonic coach, measured the cutting board his father gave his mother in 1913 and noted its surface was worn to a depth of 3/8 inch. Reminiscing about the Depression, Joe Haddad said, "What depression? Nothing changed for us." Martha's 3 sons joked about their mother shaking them down for money when they came home from work. Hearing this, Mimi bristled, saying, she did not, and then, because she knew her mother had, said, "What was Mom supposed to do? She had 3 little girls at home." They hid their smiles, and she too, along with surprise at emotions from way back when.